Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now our fourth lecture, looking at content from Chapter 1 of the textbook. And in this particular lecture, as you can see from this title slide, we are considering the topic of economic systems. How does business intersect and work within a world, within a situation, within an environmental context that considers different types of economic systems depending where in the world, what country, what nation, what government that you are conducting business in. And so the first thing we need to do is define an economic system. An economic system is, well, a set of policies and decisions and regulations about how a nation allocates its resources among its citizens, both individuals and organizations. And so you sort of see from the diagram there the attempt to describe the fact that every nation is going to have a set of resources, and it's going to use those resources to create a set of goods, services, and social benefits, which then benefit individuals, organizations, the government itself. So really what an economic system is a system which answers the question, how do we take those resources and efficiently and effectively create goods and outputs that our citizens need, and how do we get them to our citizens? A closer look at this then, a nation's economy will benefit from the resources which it has for inputs. In other words, a nation's economy takes, for instance, that country's natural resources, whether it's oil reserves or land that is fertile to grow agricultural products, to money and capital, or the labor and skill of the citizens of that country, to the business and industry that works and resides in that country, to, quite frankly, as has been described in academic concept, the means of production. And it uses all of those resources as inputs to create, well, outputs. You see them. Goods and services that consumers enjoy, as well as created wealth for citizens, as well as social goods and social benefits like police forces or fire departments or infrastructure like roads and public utilities and safe drinking water and all the kinds of things that we enjoy as, especially here in the United States, as a developed nation. And so the question is, how does a nation do this efficiently and effectively? How does it take these resources and create policies and procedures and regulations and laws to, in an orderly fashion, get the most out of those resources in creating those outputs? Well, over time, what has developed in both the rule of nations and governments, as well as in the academic discourse and conversation about economics, there are two main types of economic systems that are generally used around the world. You see them here. The first is the planned economy, which essentially takes its name from the fact that a planned economy relies on centralized planning. You see there in the first bullet point. It relies on a centralized government to control all or most factors of production, and therefore a centralized decision-making agency makes all or most of the production and allocation decisions. Now, ideologically, this is what is sometimes called socialism, and we sometimes use the term socialism as a synonym for communism. Communism is related, but is more of a political ideology than an economic ideology. Again, this is a discussion on economic systems. This isn't a political science course. As such, there are planned economies which tend to be socialist in nature, which are generally known for this, the second bullet point, centralized decision-making, making all or most production and allocation decisions. Now, we compare and contrast planned economies with market economies. You see they're the second category. Market economies are economies where, generally speaking, individual producers and consumers control production and allocation decisions by creating combinations of supply and demand. And so the market itself, market mechanisms themselves, end up resulting in decisions about how much to produce, how much is consumed, and where and how production is allocated to consumers. This is generally, by the way, an example, what we call capitalism or the free market system. There are many, many examples of the free market system around the world. Generally speaking, the U.S. economy has many, many aspects of a free market system in our economy, as does countries in the European Union have many elements of a market economy in the way that they allocate resources, outputs, and allocate towards individuals and citizens. Now, we do need to say that from an academic perspective, we have these two methods or two systems that have been suggested conceptually. But in real life, many, many actual countries use what we would actually call a mixed market economy. And a mixed market economy, you see the textbook definition there, an economy which has characteristics of both planned and market economies in the way that they actually carry out economic decisions. And one of the things that gets included in many mixed market economies is the concept of privatization, the process of converting government enterprises, or what was once a government enterprise, into privately owned companies. And so this is why I've placed there in this diagram here, this illustration on the far right of the slide of China, because China has many, many elements of a mixed market economy. It is an economy that started perhaps as a planned economy and now has taken on a great deal of privatization. In other words, many enterprises which once were owned by the government are now ostensibly owned by privately owned companies. In fact, if we're honest, the United States, we have celebrated for generations the fact that we are a free market economy, and yet we have many elements in the United States of centralized planned decision making in certain domains and certain industries. For instance, our utilities, although many of our utility companies are privately owned, they're tightly controlled and regulated. We only have here, for instance, here in Northern California, Pacific Gas and Electric as our primary utility company. We have our police and fire departments, which are generally speaking controlled by the government. And now we have our healthcare system with great encroachment from the federal government in what was once a collection of privately owned industries. Now, all of these things tend to point to the fact that, especially with large economies, neither the planned economy nor the purely market economy always delivers in all industries, in all domains, the most efficient, the most effective way to allocate and make allocation decisions about resources, outputs, and how to allocate them to citizens who need them. Most large companies with healthy economies have some mixture of both planned elements and market elements in the way that they allocate resources and outputs to citizens. Something to keep in mind as we will continue the debate and the discussion. For as long as perhaps as we have national governments, we'll continue the discussion and the debate which elements of what particular academically conceptual economic systems work best in particular nations, circumstances, contexts, nations. These are the kinds of things we continue to talk about, and something that we need to be aware of as we talk about the nature of business around the world and right here at home. Hope this is helpful. We'll see you in the next lecture.